Thank you everyone for attending the NFU's webinar series, NF University. Our presenter today is Almuth Ernsting, and the topic is solid biofuels, agricultural biomass, and BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Almuth Ernsting co-founded Biofuelwatch in 2006. She continues researching, publishing reports and articles, and campaigning to critically understand different forms of bioenergy and their impacts on climate, forests, and other ecosystems and communities. Her research work focuses on liquid biofuels, wood-based biomass, biochar, and BECCS. Almuth, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much. Let me start by sharing 1 sec. Slideshow. Okay, right. So I think as you already know, BECCS, it stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And it really is a term that refers to capturing carbon dioxide from biomass, biogas, biomethane, or biofuel production, and then storing the carbon dioxide in some geological reservoir. There's another term you might see, or you quite often see, which is BECCS with a U, or BCCUS. The U would stand for the same carbon capture, but the carbon not being stored, but instead being used. And in fact, the main way of using, one of the main ways of using it that's being proposed and done on a very small scale is in greenhouses. So it'll just end up in the atmosphere again. So just to clarify the terms. Okay. Now, very briefly, how BECCS works in theory, although in reality, we'll see. So the idea, the whole idea is behind it, what the proponents claim is that you have plants, it says trees, but potentially also crops, taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then being harvested, the energy is burned for energy, the energy is used, and then the carbon dioxide is captured and stored underground. And because of this idealized model, the whole technology is referred to as carbon neutral, as carbon negative, and as a way of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. However, that is the idealized version of it, and how it is promoted. Now, looking at the theoretical, this whole concept of BECCS as carbon negative, there are 3 key problems with that. The first one is that bioenergy in itself relies on, it's the most land-intensive form of energy. It's to get a unit, even without carbon capture, to get a unit of energy from burning wood or growing crops for bioenergy is something like 20 times, at least 20 times the amount of land as you would need for getting the same solar photovoltaics. So yeah, it would mean chopping down huge amounts of wood and having land use change on a vast scale. It relies on the false idea that biomass energy is inherently carbon neutral. I'll go into that next, why it isn't. And on top of that, it requires, to make BECCS, try and get BECCS to work, it would require billions of dollars in public funding. And that it means taking money away from really important, effective climate change mitigations like energy conservation and genuine renewable energy. So the idea that BECCS is carbon negative relies on the false belief that bioenergy in itself is inherently carbon neutral. And inherently, I mean, even the people who say that would agree that if you ship pellets across the Atlantic, there are some fossil fuels involved. But they argue that the bioenergy side, the biomass side of it, is zero carbon. Now, that is, well, for without carbon capture, it means you completely ignore the CO2 actually being emitted, which is on a par, more or less on a par with that, at least on a par with the CO2 emitted from burning coal per unit of energy. But you also ignore the fact that if wood is burned, you have more logging, less carbon, so carbon gets lost from the forests and less carbon will be sequestered by mature trees. If you're talking of trees, if you're talking of land, they would ignore the land use change and what that means for the carbon cycle. So the last picture was about woods, but although I'm supposed to speak about BECCS from solid biomass, it is worth saying that the only type of so-called BECCS actually happening, albeit on a very small scale, involves ethanol fermentation and not burning solid biomass. That's happening in any form or shape at the moment. And so the world's first so-called BECCS project was a Decatur facility in I think, was it Iowa, Illinois? Sorry, but somewhere in the U.S. Midwest. And yeah, this is from a magazine called Carbon Brief, which looked at that facility and showed that the amount of CO2 captured, this amount of CO2 you can capture from ethanol fermentation is far less than the amount of CO2 emitted from burning fossil gas to run the refinery. So yes, they did capture that, and that's fairly easy in the case of ethanol fermentation, but it's absolutely not carbon negative, even if you only look at the fossil fuel emissions. If you only look at fossil fuel emissions, there's still net emissions from that particular refinery, and that would really be very similar for most of the ethanol refineries around the world. Certainly in North America, where it's been tried, and Europe. Now, it's even worse. So the last figures were fossil fuel emissions, but there's a study just looking at ethanol, and I won't go into many more details. My colleague read the study, and it's just showing that, if you look at the green, by lots and lots of, lots of different models, you can have the ethanol emissions to do with, if you add on the land use change emissions of ethanol itself, they can be more than those from gasoline in at least 2 out of the 3 models according to the study. So yeah, indirect land use change, direct land use change make it even worse. So yes, ethanol, linking that to BECCS is feasible, but it's not great for the climate. So going back to biomass in general, where does the ideas on especially wood biomass, burning crops, burning wood, solid biomass, where does it come from, the idea that it's carbon neutral? This is from this is from a paper by the Environmental Paper Network that has a biomass working group. They've got a really good paper on the carbon accounting error. And basically, it comes from the fact that under the UN framework, under the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, it was agreed that when biomass is burned, so you don't account for the carbon emissions in the energy sector, because you're supposed to account for the loss of carbon in the forest where the trees were cut down, or the loss of carbon, well, also in the case of biofuels, for example, if it's coming from palm oil or soya, the loss of carbon through land conversion in South America, or Indonesia, wherever the feedstock comes from. So it's not saying the UN Framework Convention, climate change doesn't say it's zero carbon. It simply says you account for it in the land use and forestry sector, not in the energy sector. But what that means, although, and I won't go into that, the actual accounting for carbon in the land and energy, land use and forestry sector is pretty woefully inadequate as well, but poorly enforced. But what it means is that the energy companies and governments in their energy policies can class this as zero carbon. So it's zero carbon on, and it helps governments to get their energy emissions down on paper. So that is where the whole idea of carbon neutral biomass comes from, something that many scientists have called a carbon accounting error. So we've now looked at the, why this whole idea of carbon neutral or carbon negative BECCS is really, really suspect. So I thought we'll do a little 3 slides about history, and one about the history of where BECCS, actually the idea of BECCS comes from. Because a lot of people think that the idea of BECCS must come from some climate scientists who've really studied this. But it actually came from 2 different teams. It came from, I won't read them out or so, but it came from 2 groups of people. It came from people involved in somebody in the pulp and paper industry, which today is still really quite very interested in the idea of BECCS, because it's a huge emitter of CO2. Sweden's pulp and paper industry is even on, it's the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the country. But also groups of people, so ASA are, they work on model. It's an Austrian institute that works on climate modeling, really important. They fed into the International Panel on Climate Change models later on. And then a guy called David Keith, who is now very, very big in geoengineering and promoting geoengineering, although not saying so much about BECCS these days. So it came really from, handful, 2 teams of two people who had this idea long time ago, and then nothing happened with it. And this is important because then eventually it was picked up by modelers. So it wasn't picked up by climate scientists. It was picked up by people doing modeling of, if we need to put some minus figure into the climate models to get keep temperatures down. So it's by the modelers, not the climate scientists. And that all came to a head in 2014. So up to 2014, BECCS was, it was very theoretical, very niche. In 2014, the IPCC report 5, assessment report 5, so not the last recent one, but the one before that, said that most mitigation scenario models involve an overshoot. So they mostly say, we're going to burn way too many fossil fuels. So we need some way of getting it out. We need some minus figure in here. And we are sticking BECCS or large-scale tree plantations into the model, and then we get down to 1.5 degrees. So in short, the idea of BECCS has never been based on any scientific assessment as to whether it would actually be carbon negative or feasible. Instead, the modelers put BECCS into their models as a placeholder for negative emissions. And at the same time, the IPCC said in that report and continues to say that BECCS is actually a very risky and uncertain technology on the, on the scientist side of things, saying that really, really clearly. So just really worth knowing that, where this actually comes from. So how much CO2 is being captured by BECCS today? Well, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is at the end of November, we published a report looking at all the BECCS projects where there's those reports of something having been captured at some point or an attempt to have been made. And both from biomass plants, not ethanol, but biomass plants and waste incinerators, but I won't speak about those. Let's just focus on biomass now. And the few biomass plants where there were reports which claimed that they had started carbon capture would not say, they have not published anything and about how much they have captured, and they would not have replied to any of our queries as to how much they've captured. So in all likelihood, it's not zero, but it's very, very, very little. So 200,000 tons would be the maximum capacity of things which are supposed to have started up, but nobody knows if they captured anything. But none of this has been sequestered. So the one plant that seems to have captured a tiny bit is one in Japan that burns residues from Indonesian palm oil, so it's palm kernel expellerate, so palm kernel residues. And they seem to have used a little bit of carbon dioxide in to fertilize algae to try and make anti-aging skin cream. So that's it. That's the only thing where we have got some indication that they've sometimes done something with carbon dioxide, but nothing has been stored. And there's currently today 3 projects, CCS projects, involving storing under the ground that involve ethanol fermentation. Not the one I showed you earlier, which was the first and biggest one. That has been stopped. Now, again, I'm not going to read all this out because it will take way too long, but important, very quick overview, because when we speak about BECCS, we speak about carbon capture. You know, we need to understand what carbon capture is all about. It's the same processes as for other carbon capture. And importantly, carbon capture itself was developed not with the idea of mitigating climate change, but as a way to clean up natural gas, i.e. fossil gas, from fields which contain toxins, hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. So it was developed as a way of making more fossil gas available to be burned for energy. And that's where the technology comes from. So when you hear the technology itself goes back to the 1920s, yes, it does. The first plant was actually in Ontario, but it had nothing to do with mitigating climate change. But nonetheless, that's how old the basic technology is. The first time that really important here and really important in the context of BECCS, the first time that carbon was sequestered from any CO2 was pumped underground was actually done for enhanced oil recovery. So I think, and that was in that was in an oil field in Texas, where they are still injecting CO2 into the oil fields. Now, what EOR is, enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, is this. When you have an oil field, initially the oil comes out quite easy. And then if it sort of stops coming out, then you can use water. And then that doesn't work anymore. And then you have to inject something else. And probably the preferred thing to inject is carbon dioxide. So you can see you've got an injection well. It pushes the oil towards the production well. And you get oil out that you would not otherwise get out. And the important thing, therefore, is that the oil you're recovering, so most of the carbon dioxide will stay underground, so one hopes, at least it won't come out immediately. However, the oil that comes out as a result of this so-called carbon CO2 sequestration is oil that would not otherwise have been recovered and would otherwise not have been burned and not have resulted in more global warming. So, EOR. Now, where are we today with CCS? All CCS in total, so you can still see it's overwhelmingly gas processing, which is where it all started. Little bit of coal and tiny bit on ethanol. So yeah, that's how it is. It's overall also not an awful lot that's actually being captured and pumped anywhere. And of that amount of CO2 that is being captured worldwide from anything, the orange is a share that is used for enhanced oil recovery to get more oil out of the ground. Yeah, so the big, yeah, one thing, the big, so I mean, the world's biggest project, as to say, is less than 6, I mean, at its most, it was less than 6 million tons in 1 year. That's the biggest in the world, but, okay, no, I do this. Yeah, going back to the EOR, this is Canada. So Canadian CCS is about 1/4, well, exactly 1/4 is genuinely pumping underground. The rest goes for enhanced oil recovery. And little overview in Canada, what we have now is, you know, all those different dots. These are operational and advanced development ones. They're almost entirely fossil fuel related. There's one small operational pilot plant in ethanol fermentation and one in advanced development, and that's it. So again, BECCS is very theoretical. I'm going through the different BECCS technologies next to say what they are. We've already done the ethanol fermentation or mentioned it, capturing it from biomass power stations or capturing it from a process that turns biomethane or biomass syngas into hydrogen with carbon capture. So ethanol, as we see, really easy, really simple, because relatively easy and simple and cheap, because you have CO2 is the sole byproduct of ethanol fermentation. So you've got a pure CO2 stream, not polluted, not mixed with anything. And that's also where there's a big push. So this is in Iowa, just where there's a proposal for all those carbon dioxide pipelines, all linked to ethanol refineries. Hasn't happened, but there's a lot of money going into it. And the US ethanol industry is heavily pushing this in Canada as a model as well. I found some interesting documents the other day. Now, how does it work from power or heat plants? Less simple, well, less easy to do, not easy to understand. So the idea here is that we have the basic process is we've got a solvent called amine solvents. So you've got your power and heat plant, you've got your flue gas, what normally comes out of the chimney, but instead you first clean it up as best as you can, and then you put it into a column of amines. They react with the carbon dioxide, and then you, and then the rest, what isn't carbon dioxide, then goes out of the stack. Then you've got those carbon dioxide-rich amines. You heat them up, cool them down, heat them up. I think this way. Anyway, big temperature changes. Yeah. In a stripper column, and that gives you the carbon dioxide. You compress it, you put it into pump it into pipeline or some other way. So that's that's the idea. It's basically you're mixing this carbon dioxide with the amines, and you strip it out. The amines go back, and it's a nice endless cycle. Except it isn't, and it isn't because when you burn stuff, you've got lots of impurities that you're not going to filter out, and they cause amines to degrade. It's a public health concern as well when they degrade. It's carcinogenic. The small particulates in the flue gases, PM 2.5, can carry the amines into the wrong plants of the parts of the plant, causing corrosion. And above all, it takes a huge amount of energy to have this cleaning, stripping it out of stripping the carbon dioxide from the amines and regenerating amines. And how much that is, we can see from the world's only, the only large-scale coal power station CCS project, really certainly coal one, is Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan. And that one is all for enhanced oil recovery, by the way, but that one uses between 30 and 31% of the plant's entire energy. So almost 1/3 of the energy from that coal unit is used to capture and compress the carbon dioxide. It's huge. And without getting too technical, in the challenges that we've seen from with biomass with coal are even greater for biomass. For one thing, because there's less experience with it, but also for reasons to do with the chemical properties of biomass. And because biomass plants are already less efficient than coal plants on the whole. So then you take away 30%, and they are really, really, really inefficient. I wasn't going to mention this because it's so totally weird to think about it, but there's something called oxyfuel combustion. I won't even go into exactly how it would work because it doesn't. But for some odd reason, it's a research and development focus of Natural Resources Canada's BECCS program. No idea why. It's never been done successfully anywhere. It was huge amounts of money were spent on such a coal project in the States. Totally failed. 2 abandoned projects, one of them costing tens of millions of dollars. So goodness knows, but yes, that's what they say. And then there's another one. I won't even say that. Fortunately, nobody is proposing that in theory might work. If you ever hear it, IGCC plant with biomass. There was this plant was built once for coal, $7.5 billion, huge cost to the state. Had to be demolished, basically. It didn't work, certainly. I mean, the coal part, it was a complete disaster. So yeah, that's the other thing you might hear as some flashy new idea for BECCS. Unlikely. Then you've got this idea of hydrogen and carbon dioxide from biomass syngas. Again, for various technical reasons, and gasification is something that I spent a long time looking into. It's another, I would say, completely impossible sci-fi solution. You would need a degree of syngas, pure syngas from gasifying biomass that nobody in the world has ever been able to achieve at scale, despite countless attempts. And then there is finally a proposal of making hydrogen and carbon dioxide from biomethane. That might work, it might technically work, absolutely, unlike the other things. It would be unbelievably inexpensive. So turning it from hydrogen, you have basically, you use, so biomethane upgrading, you would use something like 85% of the energy contained in biogas is going to be lost during that process, even without carbon capture, and then even more. So you would end up with something like probably 10% of the energy in biogas and 90% is just wasted. It's never been attempted at scale. It's should work technically, but it would be a crazy thing to do. So what we've seen, and this is a picture actually my daughter drew from our first BECCS report back in 2015, about carbon sucking extraterrestrial as a symbol for BECCS, for people saying, but we absolutely need carbon negative BECCS. It doesn't mean that it's not in a sci-fi realm. It really is as sci-fi as this, to think that we can cool the planet or we can stabilize climate change, the climate with BECCS in future. So that's going through the technologies and all that, but you might wonder, why should we be concerned if we don't think it's going to happen? Why bother? You know, should we just say, okay, nothing to worry about then? No, that would be wrong. I'm very wrong. So I'm in the UK, I'm in Scotland, but I'm in the UK, and my colleagues in the UK, their main work for the last, I don't know how many years, has been to try and stop subsidies for this power station, Drax. They burn 8.3 million tons of wood pellets a year, more than 155%, so more than 1.5 times the UK's annual wood harvest. All of it imported, much of it from Canada. And they receive the equivalent of over 2.9 million Canadian dollars in subsidies every single day in 2022 at a time of record high electricity prices. Now, Drax has a problem. Its subsidies is going to end in 2027. And Drax has been told you only get a chance of new subsidies if you capture and sequester the carbon. So they say, all right then, we'll capture 8 million tons of CO2 from biomass burning from 2027. So we can keep getting our subsidies, great. Except, as we've seen, nobody has that ability to do that. You know, we are, if anybody could ever do it, we are probably decades away from anyone achieving that, if ever. Drax has actually captured 27 tons of carbon dioxide so far, 27. They want to scale to 8 million. It's anyone should see that as crazy. And all what they've captured has been vented to the atmosphere. But they have persuaded the government at the moment, or group within the government, to recommend giving them subsidies, provided they install carbon capture equipment, regardless of whether they actually manage to capture any CO2. So they would just have to get the equipment installed and, hey, millions more in subsidies, hundreds of millions more in subsidies every year. That's the current proposal. Fortunately, hasn't been agreed yet, and we're fighting hard to stop that. Now, since you're all in Canada, this is specifically what Drax's biomass means for Canada's forests. These are pictures taken by Standards and Conservation North for British Columbia, where Drax has acquired a number of pellet mills, where they've acquired them in British Columbia and Alberta. This is from British Columbia. And they've been shown on the BBC and CBC this year, have revealed, how Drax itself is been logging old growth forest to make pellets that are then shipped and burned in the UK. So this is how BECCS has the talk about BECCS has real consequences on the ground now already, even if carbon capture is unlikely. And secondly, and that is the bigger global, by this is very specific on Drax, and they are not the only ones trying this, just the most advanced, is secondly, carbon dioxide removal in itself, this term, this concept, is massively used to legitimize fossil fuel burning. Both direct air capture, which doesn't work either, and it's hugely inefficient. Now, fortunately, I don't have to talk about that, and BECCS. Are being promoted as ways to pretend that we can have net zero, that we can keep warming to 1.5 degrees without having to rapidly stop burning fossil fuels. These countries around the world, net zero strategies rely on some form or other of carbon removals. 27% of countries so far have written BECCS into the long-term plans, 13% direct air capture. It is strong push at the UNFCCC convention, certainly at the COPs, the most recent one in Egypt, to get BECCS and other carbon capture and storage included in a future new carbon market under what's called the Article 6.4 negotiations, which people we work with are very, very involved in trying to stop this. Not something I'm personally involved in, but but allies, our partners are, which is great. In the European Union, the same. There is now a proposal for carbon removal certification framework published last November, which would allow BECCS and other so-called carbon removal technologies to get into carbon trading mechanisms. Really worrying. We're part of a big group, Real Zero Europe, fighting that. And Canada, the US as well, but yes, this is Canada. Speaking about Canada, BECCS is included in Canada's long-term strategy submission to the UNFCCC. And yeah, there you can see, a nice, very big polluter, nice polluter, getting a $2.5 million grant for BECCS feasibility study, again, at a pulp mill. Unlikely to work at scale, I would think, but again, a way to, try and get subsidies and, try and get support. On a smaller scale with drugs, as far as that is concerned, but, another polluter using BECCS for getting something from the state, basically. So last slide, key conclusions. Carbon capture, it will be most likely for enhanced oil recovery, could funnel new subsidies in the ethanol refining, and which is bad, bad for land use, bad for the climate. Other forms, bad for food as well, for food prices. Other forms of BECCS are not realistic at scale, but could lead to new subsidies for polluters, and BECCS serves as a means to legitimize more fossil fuel burning and other dirty energy. And that's the last slide.
Thank you very much, Almuth.